Hi, everybody. Welcome to our DAT IQ Weekly Market Update. This is our update for February the 11th, episode 326. I'm Dean Croak, Market Analyst here at DAT, coming to you from Australia, where it's summer. Chad is our co-host, and today we've got a very special guest, long-term friend, colleague from Omnitrack's Analytics days, Tom Cuthbertson, who's our resident ELD and hours of service expert in the US. Welcome, Tom. Good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been too long. We worked together, I think, during the period where I think Omnitracks were writing the software, weren't they, to get ahead of the ELD mandate? Was that the timeline?
Yeah, that's correct. We issued 5 different products out on that, including Canada.
Yeah. It's hard to believe that it's 8 years. I think I was looking at the calendar the other day. Time has flown.
I know.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe I was working on the ELD regulation all the way back to 2005.
Yeah, because that was 2004 was the major change. They
gave the first one a shot and it didn't work.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm speaking at a conference here in Australia on that timeline because I hosted the FMCSA and DOT and Transport Canada and showed them how we ran fatigue management pilots down here, and they took some of our best practices from Australia back in 1997 back to the US and wrote some of that into the regulations in terms of how you design hours of service in a way that drives safety. Transport Canada, interestingly, were the most adoptive of all of those techniques. That's why their hours of service is a little bit different, a bit more flexibility. Anyway, how's things, Chad?
Things are good. Yeah, we're coming at full swing into spring now, moving into summer very quickly. It's in the 80s down here. We got the produce season picking up. Strawberries have been picked for a couple of months now. I was just looking at some of the trends, and
it's some moving too.
Central Florida is picking up with blueberries, blackberries here in the next month or two, and then watermelon. So it'll all peak around March, April.
Yeah, that's great news considering where we were with some of those hurricanes before Christmas. Yeah. All right, Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself for those that haven't met you.
Well, I've been in the transportation industry going on 34 years. I started on the carrier side with a very large, at the time was the biggest chemical hauler in the United States, a very complex carrier. I went over to the supplier side, and I've been doing regulatory and telematics product development and a lot of regulatory interaction for probably 25 years or so. I worked extensively with FMCSA through the regulation process. I was also a stakeholder in Canada for their ELD. I started in that around 2012 all the way through when it was issued. So at this point, then as you well know, I certified and we modified the 5 products at Omnitracks that made it to being registered as full-fledged ELD products.
Well, looking forward to bringing you back a little bit later, especially around some of the challenges companies have faced, some of the techniques that people are using to circumvent ELDs from remote technologies. All right, so let's dive into the market update and some of the key trends we're watching this week. Of course, the word tariffs is back on the agenda. We're not sure how that's going to play out this week, but a 25% on aluminum and steel imports will certainly have a big impact on the freight market. In the spot market, rates cooled again. They're now almost identical to last year, but sitting about 7 cents a mile higher than the week 6 average, 7-day rolling average going back to 2016 when you exclude the pandemic impacted years. So a lot of similarity there, nothing unusual in terms of where rates are at the moment. From the start of each year to the end of March, dry van rates typically drop about 18 cents a mile. They're on the same trajectory right now based on Ratecast. It has rates around $1.65 a mile by the time we get to the end of March. As Chad mentioned, the one bright spot is Miami ahead of Valentine's Day as flowers start arriving from Ecuador and Colombia. We're in the second of the busiest shipping weeks out of Miami. Reefer spot rates were up 11% last week outbound from Miami. Volumes are up 24% week over week. We'll see similar volumes this week. Chad mentioned strawberries and blueberries in Lakeland. Rates were flat week over week, but volumes were up 14%. So some of that capacity is certainly heading further south to Miami to take advantage of the surge in fresh cut flower volumes. Of course, Chad's got the Plant City Strawberry Festival in 2 weeks. And the USDA reported a slight shortage of trucks last week in Florida for winter vegetables, tomatoes, and strawberries. Other things we're watching, the ISM PMI came out last week. It expanded. It's the first month of growth after 26 months of contraction. That's great news for manufacturing. Zach Rogers Logistics Managers Index came in at 62.0. That's up 4.7 from December. It's the fastest reading, the expansion of the index in 3 years. Most of that's got a lot to do with the increasing volumes that we're seeing coming in from overseas. Some of the preliminary numbers on imports looks like about another record high for January. I'll have the full numbers for January imports next week's show. But the way the preliminary numbers are looking like could be another record month for imports as shippers were looking to get ahead of some of the proposed tariffs. Market update will be out this evening. Go to dat.com/market update for the full form version of today's update. So let's quickly go through some of the things we're watching. Load to truck ratio, load posts were sitting about 2% higher than last year, and about 4% higher than this time in 2018. Of course, this was back in 2018. This was just prior to that rate rally taking off. Last week's dry van load to truck ratio ended the week at, let me just double check that, 4.77. In the refrigerated market, volumes are about 9% higher than last year and 22% higher than the week 6 average going back to 2016. Load to truck ratio ended the week at 8.64. And in flatbed, load post volumes are up last week about 4%, sitting about 14% higher than last year, but 17% lower than the week 6 average over the last 8 years. The load to truck ratio ended the week at 26.35. Having a quick look at our year-over-year look at spot rates, capacity continues to ease following another 4-cent per mile decrease. The national 7-day rolling average ended last week at $1.68. Volumes of loads moved were down 2% last week to start off the first shipping week of February. On our top 50 lanes ranked on the volume of loads moved, carriers were paid an average of $2 a mile. That represents a decrease of 3 cents a mile week over week. However, the average remains about 32 cents a mile higher than the national 7-day rolling average. In the refrigerated market, rates dropped 2 cents a mile last week. They've dropped about 22 cents a mile or 10% in the last month, following last week's 4-cent per mile decrease. This is the third week of decreases in this range. A lot of that's got to do with the warmer weather, relatively speaking, now that shippers have reduced some of their protect from freeze exposure from the bitter cold weather. The national average is $1.99. That's lower than last year by about 3 cents per mile. And in flatbed, there was no change in last week's national average flatbed rate. That was the third week we've had almost no change. Carriers were paid an average of $2 a mile, same as refrigerated. It's also identical to the flatbed spot rate for the last 2 years, as we covered on the show last week. For just over 2 years, the flatbed average line haul rate for the 7-day rolling average has sat at about $2 a mile. Rates are about 2 cents a mile higher than where they were in 2018. I think that's an interesting inflection point. I don't expect that we'll see another 2018 year, but rates are identical to where they were at that time. And of course, 2018 was when the flatbed rate rally really started to take off in early February. Quick look at our forecast this week. Remember, these are our short-term forecasts out 35 days using our flagship RateCast product. That's in green. That's telling us what we think line haul, excluding fuel, for loads over 550 miles will be out 35 days. This more heavily weights long-term seasonal trends, so it's not factoring in things like tariffs that are coming down the pike. The forecast in green is bounded by an upper and lower forward-looking bands. In gold or yellow, that's the upper band, and the red is the more pessimistic lower band. RateCast is thinking that flatbeds are going to be down about 4 cents a mile. You can definitely see a trend where all the way through February, rates are bottoming out. That's very interesting. It's happened a little bit earlier this year. The rate of decrease in the last 3 weeks has sort of accelerated to a point where some of the seasonal decreases in rates may have already happened. That's certainly what RateCast is suggesting from where we go now out to 35 days at $1.65 per mile. Low case has rates down 10 cents a mile. Best case scenario has rates up 4 cents per mile. So this is something we're watching very carefully in February as we get through winter and start to see some of that spring replenishment volume start to move throughout the market. Similar trend in the refrigerated market. RateCast has reefer rates down 3 cents a mile out to the middle of March, averaging $1.96 by the time we get there. So that's down 4 cents a mile 3 to 4 cents a mile. Low case scenario has rates down 9, high case has rates up 5. Again, seasonally on track with what we'd normally expect for refrigerated rates. We don't normally see the national needle start to move until we get to the Vidalia onion pack date, which is going to be middle April. That's when we really start to see volumes in the southeast start to move in significant amounts. And flatbed, a little bit of a change in the forecast this week. It's looking for more of an upward trajectory. Again, that's not a surprise as we get into the warmer months out through February and into March. We start to see a lot of flatbed volumes start to move, especially into places like Lowe's and Home Depot car parks. You'll see full of gardening mulch that a lot of flatbeds start to move. Of course, we're seeing a lot more activity in the northeast. The ground hasn't frozen again for the second year, so a lot of construction activity still going on and a lot of flatbed volume moving despite that. At the March 15, Ratecast has rates at about 206. Low case scenario has rates up 6 cents a mile, high case up 12 cents a mile. But again, I think Ratecast is pretty well spot on where it's thinking about the market right now as capacity continues to ease and carrier exits continue. Even though exits slowed down in January, we're still seeing carriers leave the market in the spot market. Over to you, Chad, for what we're seeing in the contract market.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And just as a reminder, everything Dean covers is from that broker to carrier perspective, from that broker buy rate, and I'll cover the shipper to carrier or broker rates. So from the top to the bottom here, we have our spot premium ratio at the top in yellow, going back to 2017. You can see over the last month, we did pop up over 0%. This is where spot rates are over contract rates. That's a really great signal of the market turning, and additional contract rate increases would be forecasted from that in the future. Our new rate differential, that's our new rates that are coming into the routing guides that are replacing old rates. So it's the result of bids. We're at exactly 0.0% right now, very balanced market. And this is similar to what we've been hearing from our shippers that have mixed results from bids. A little bit of rate increases, maybe some slight decreases, but nothing significant on either side. Pretty good sign of a very balanced market right now with some slow growth. Contract rate index, very slight trend up and to the right, nothing significant at all. And then on to temp control or reefer. We're up above that spot premium ratio, above 0% for the last couple of weeks. Maybe some of that winter storm activity there in the week starting 126. And then new rate differential really bouncing around zeros, just to slightly below most recent data point, 0.1% above. And contract rate index is pretty flat. And then the last graph we have here is all three dry van, temp control, and flatbed rate per mile. This is our longer haul freight going back to 2016. And you can see that balanced market where spot rates equal contract rates for both dry van and temp control. On flatbed, slightly different story where we do see contract rates increasing. These are typically shorter term contract rates, where flatbed contracts usually are longer duration than from our larger shippers for temp control or dry van. So that's a wrap for contract rates.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. All right, let's bring Tom back in. Todd, easy question to start off. We're about 8 years into ELDs, the electronic log device, part of the mandate. What's been the biggest impact on truckload carriers from your perspective?
I think one of the things that I've seen that is audit, because now what happens is FMC, because of the way the technology was designed, they can do in-house audits and hours. They can do hours of service audits remotely, and they put out letters right now because of a feature called ERODS, Electronic Record of Duty Status. They can have the carrier. They'll give a list to the carrier of X number of drivers for certain periods, and there's a requirement in the audit papers that says that the device or the system has to be able to transfer 30 days of logs of any individual to FMCSA, and it's through the ERODS fashion. So it's all electronically transferred. And they have a pretty good security system wrapped around that. But I don't think carriers all the time understand what that whole remote audit means, because there's another function within the device that was required, because DLD, as you well know, is one of the main things is capture all the drive time. and make sure you capture accurate drive time. Well, if a driver decides not to log in, or they're learning the system and they don't log in, now you have what they call unidentified vehicle moves, which don't have a driver identified, they don't have a category. One of the real key things that the DOT audits, and I've been involved in a good number of audits with them, is that they want to see that you're managing the unidentified drive segments. They want to make sure that you're assigning them to something, you're accounting for them, you're giving them back to the driver that should be there. And that takes a significant amount of time to manage that under certain carriers if they don't do a sufficient amount of training to make sure their drivers understand what the implications are. I said that those two things right there, I think, are biggest challenges, because if you don't manage this unidentified, it can really consume manpower within a carrier.
I was in Barstow, California on my way to Australia last Friday, and I was always call in there and go to the 30-year-old Black Bear Diner. It's kind of an institution on the old Route 66 for truckers that have been in the industry. And I was watching a truck pull out from, it was about a mile away, and I noticed it because it was a really nice big Kenworth with a lot of stainless steel on it. And it was shimmering in the sunrise. And he pulled out on the road and he proceeded to drive at, I'm going to guess, 4.99 miles an hour for the best part of 20 minutes to get to the truck stop. And of course, I knew exactly what he was doing. It was the ELD creep, where you don't trigger on-duty driving at once you go over 5 miles an hour. So while you sit under 5 miles an hour, you don't have any on-duty driving time, which you see in traffic all the time. The truckers just sort of creeping along to preserve their hours. But it leads to the question I want to ask you about speed. If that audit is done, are they auditing just unassigned drive time, or are they actually auditing GPS speed? Because the two are very different, right? Hours of service compliance doesn't measure the speed of the truck, just the hours it's driving, correct?
Right. It's the time, because first off, the regulation doesn't allow the ELD to use GPS for any allocation or speed determination. GPS is recorded for all the events, and then a location report is recorded once an hour, only while the vehicle's in motion. And it's funny you bring that up about the 5 mile an hour, because I would get asked that when I was giving presentations all the time. And I said, it's a funny thing. If you go on duty at point A and you inch your truck around for about 10 miles at 4.9 and it doesn't trigger drive time, and then you do another event 20 miles away, I kind of think A-Rods will pick it up and somebody will notice that. So, I'll give credit to FMCSA, when they wrote that technology. And by the way, I was involved with the technical write-up on that with MIXAC. And so don't blame me for the whole regulation,
Just part of it.
It's only part my fault. So
at Omnitrax, though, we geofenced the trucks at, was it a mile and up to 20 miles an hour before we had on duty? Was that the number?
No. I think where that confusion comes from is they have a feature in there called yard move. Right. And yard move, if you're in yard move and it's supposedly only being used in a yard, non-public access. So you wouldn't count that drive time jockeying around the yard, because as you well know, some of those huge suppliers, their yards are 3 miles deep. So you were counting drive time on private property that really shouldn't be required. So what happens with that is, losing my train of thought here for a minute. We commented early on at Omnitrax about, you got to do something about this yard move. You can't make it solely on the basis of the driver. So UPS had put in an exemption request to allow you to have a geofence of yard move. And then you could break the geofence and then you'd be an automatic drive. And then the 20 miles an hour was the other option that we wrote up and requested. That if you exceed 20 miles per hour, because most yards are either 10 or 15 miles per hour. So if you get to 20 miles per hour, you're either breaking the yard rule, so sad, too bad, go to drive, or you actually left the yard. Because what our reasoning for all that was, if you have to have a driver remind himself 20 miles later to come out of yard move, that edit is extensive, and it's going to be one messed up edit. It's not going to work well.
Right.
Hey, Tom, Tom, if we could go back to the audits that you mentioned, could you just tell me a little bit about what that process looks like? I haven't been close to that in almost 20 years. And so I'm sure it's changed quite a bit. What is the timeline from the time you're given notice that you're being audited to the deadline that you have? And
let's put it this way. So they have triggers on who they're going to audit, because they'll see scale house issues. They'll see a lot of different things. And they'll actually use those scale house opportunities that they see where there's inspection violations to pick what drivers. Okay. But what happens now is ERODS gives a detailed, let's put it this way, the 122 pages of technical specs for the ELD is mostly how to capture events, transactions, on duty, off duty, all that kind of thing. Intermittent, meaning where the motions, where did I go with personal conveyance, where did I go off personal conveyance, all that. So it's a very detailed transaction set. So in an 8-day period, you have a pretty substantial record, and enforcement has a software package that FMCSA and anybody at roadside that does an inspection has that looks at this. And when we were in the Mix Act, a lot of enforcement that was part of the committee said, we want a red, green, yellow light indicator when we review these logs in the software. So if somebody had used personal conveyance quite a bit, right, they're looking at this remotely and saying, boy, I want to check this carrier out or this driver. He uses personal conveyance all the time. And personal conveyance is one of the most misused, not understood pieces within the regulation. People use it misappropriately to the point of a violation. So they will take those 30 days of information for a particular driver, and whether John or Mary was there for the 30 days or not, they'll request that. They just sit there in their own office and start crunking through the numbers. Now, you may only get a 5-day notice, the letter. You may get a 5-day notice that says, hey, guess what? We'll see you next Tuesday, and we want to see John, Mary, Frank, Harry, and Susie, right? We want their log data for these periods of time.
Right. So
they can now do that in a remote request. They don't even have to go in the office. They'll just send you a letter and say, well, we'll give you 3 days to get this, because all the logs in the regulation are required to be presented on demand.
It's Tom, it's amazing how things have evolved. I was thinking back to our days at Omnitrax, one of our big customers. This was 2007. They were scanning in paper logs into a digital format, and of course the problem was that where the driver was recording their activity didn't line up with toll receipts or fuel receipts, and it was a 6-figure fine. And the carrier at that time, and of course they were talking to all the other large carriers, that was really the time when they decided to put in electronic logs. It was 10 years before the ELD mandate came in. That's when we saw a significant uptake in the adoption of electronic logs. Of course, they'd been around since, I think Werner put in e-logs back in 1998. So electronic logs weren't a new thing.
And the ALBR regulation actually came out in 1995, but it was a page-and-a-half regulation. Okay. That's when the ECM came out. People started having ECMs in their tractors and things like that. Still not very well thought out, but hey, it worked, right? So what they did, though, in the regulation, that they give you the ability to have different type of those fuel receipts and everything. One of the issues, I was with an auditor one time, that the daylight savings time, right? They wrote them up, and the servers at that truck stop hadn't updated. They didn't set the option to go to daylight savings. And their toll receipts were an hour off. Well, as you will know, an hour off could be 40 to 50 miles. So they started writing them up because the fuel receipts were wrong, right? And the meal receipts were wrong because the registers off the servers were posting an incorrect hour. Right. So I've run into that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. It's so we built Fleet Risk Advisors, the predictive modeling company that Omnitrax purchased back then, but we built it using all sorts of data from all of the carriers' operating systems. When ELDs came out, it surpassed every single data set that a company had in terms of its predictive power. Because the ELD data set is so rich in terms of its, zeros and ones in 1 minute increments, and it's consistent. And it predicts performance, human physiology, it predicts sleep, it predicts so much about driver behavior. It's been one of the best and worst things from a driver perspective. Tom, talk about some of the, there's not a week goes past or a month, maybe to be fair, where an ELD provider is struck off the list. What's going on behind that? Like, where are companies not getting that right?
Well, there's several pieces of that, right? Just to give you quick statistics, okay? Since 2023, FMCSA themselves have revoked 45 devices.
Wow.
Okay. Self-revoked devices is in the neighborhood about 265. But what's still laying out there, right, is over 1,000 devices that are registered and not revoked in any form. Okay. So when you look at that, what they're starting to do is I know I've had some interactions with the FMCSA group that's doing this audit and revoking process. And what they're looking at is, and I think suppliers don't understand, that their supplier login page has a performance web that says if their eRODS is not being accepted. Because what there is there's a two-piece process to this. There's one validator that looks at all the raw data to make sure that the raw data and the transactions are recorded correctly. Okay, if it does not pass the validator, FMCSA gets alerts what the errors are. If it goes in to the validator and it's accepted by the eRODS, if there's something that's, let's say, shady or not quite the way it's expected, they'll also get an alert. So the supplier can have a full report of what they should be looking at. And I've found many of these suppliers don't go into their webpage and look at the performance of eRODS, because eROD performance is what the trigger is for FMCSA to say, go look at me. Now, there's other mechanisms that have been there all along where they have an email called ELD Tech. Okay. And if enforcement sees something at roadside that they don't like or they don't think is compliant, enforcement has an email exchange with the agency to tell them these devices are not doing the right thing. Let me tell you why. And they'll have eRODS files, they'll send them and things like that. Or they'll find out that drivers are finding a way to skirt around the way the ELD is working, which says this ELD is not compliant. So those kinds of things are what the agency is doing and finding out. So they have barometers, right? A carrier may have a device and she's saying, look, I know this is not working right. So they go to the supplier, ask them to fix it. The supplier doesn't fix it. They write the ELD Tech and say, my supplier is not working. I want to have a compliant device. I'm reporting it. So there's a lot of, different avenues that they get their information from. Some of it's straight up on just lack of performance.
Tom, I think you mentioned before the show that about 5 providers are getting revoked per month.
I think about every few months, right?
Every few months. It seems like a lot. How do carriers get notified about this? And is there
it gets published on the webpage, and then every trade magazine out there, as soon as it's published on the ELD webpage for FMCSA, they just broadcast it, right? Okay. So if somebody doesn't realize that their device has had a problem after all that notification process, then they have a problem. But what they typically give them is 60 days to find a replacement.
Okay.
Right. And that 60 days is not a long time, because if you have a fleet of 150 trucks, we'll say, maybe not a huge fleet, but not small, right? You have to worry about getting the devices, getting the trucks in, getting them installed, train your drivers, because not all devices are equal. Right. Everybody has their own little design, because a lot of times there's an engineering group, very smart people They say, oh, we can make money making these things. It's only a technical specification. They have no regulatory background whatsoever, and they write to the technical spec. But they forget about what does 395.8 actually mean, which is the hours of service regulation, right? All the underlying innuendos and idiosyncrasies that go along with regulations. And most of them don't even know how to read a regulation. So that puts carriers in a quandary when they say, got to go find a new one. Because a lot of these people never did any telematics providing. They just wrote an ELD. So they're just learning what's an engine ECM going to do, and where do I get the data, and what transactions do I have to look at.
Very interesting. Tom, last question, and it's got to do with cybersecurity. You and I had some experience back in South America with Omnitrax where they were shutting down trucks by pulling alongside of them. There was a study done by Colorado State University on an unused airstrip where they were able to reflash the memory of the ELD device and essentially from the vehicle next to the truck at speed, shut down the truck to slow it down and stop it. What sort of things should carriers be looking for in terms of the node, as in the ELD device is a node on a network and its vulnerabilities?
Well, that study I had a little problem with anyway. So, do we have very smart people out there doing cybersecurity and doing bad things? Yes. Okay. So what you're looking for is, are the servers, do they have the right front-end processors? Are they following, is the device at minimum following the requirements that FMCSA published, right? Are they complying to the NIST regulation? Do they have the right PIC files? Do they have the right email security, right? The carrier themselves have to make sure that their own servers are protected, right? And there's so much going on right now in the cybersecurity area. And some of these are written up where somebody walked around with a laptop and got in through the RF or the passive RF on the tire. That's not going to happen. Right. But you've seen yourself, some of the big suppliers, they've been hijacked for ransom because they got into their servers. So is it real? Yes, it's absolutely real. But if you don't know what's going on, you need to take a look at the regulation requirements and at least make sure that supplier is meeting the minimum security requirements of the ELD.
Great advice. Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah.
Right. And what they can do is many of the industry groups, okay, if you look at, I was on TMC forever, right? But we've developed a cybersecurity task force at TMC, and they publish papers. So if you were a member of ATA or TMC, you could get copies of these papers, and there's very smart people on these committees. And that would be another thing to do, to get those papers and look at them to see what their recommendations are, because as you know, with TMC, we do recommended practices.
Right.
So a recommended practice could be followed by a carrier, and they could hand that paper to the supplier and say, either meet this or see you later. I don't want you. I want to go to the next person.
Right. Tom, this has gone way too quick. How can people get in contact with you if they've got more questions or need your consulting expertise?
Well, my email address is tomc061188@gmail.com. So I'm available there. I won't give out my phone number, but that email address would be the best thing to get a hold of me at.
Thank you. Yeah, good. Well, we'll get you back on the show at some point later in the year. Just quickly, are there any regulatory changes that carriers and brokers should be aware of with ELDs, or is it status quo for the moment?
Well, it's status quo, but there's one that I don't think people were aware of. Okay, back in December of 2022, up to that point, if you couldn't transfer your ERODS file at roadside, you didn't get any points. There was no severity. Right. But in December of 2022, and they always do this right at the end of the year when people are not paying attention because there's freight's hot, people are looking, but they snuck in that, by the way, if you can't transfer at roadside, it's now a 3-point severity level on the violation, which is pretty substantial, going from 0 to 3. Yeah. And I would tell carriers to pay attention to those severity points within ELD, especially when you're talking about training, the driver manual in the truck. People forget about those things, and they can carry a 1 or a 2 point severity.
That's significant. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Tom. A couple of shout outs. This week's Freight Vine podcast, Chris Kappas is talking to Matt McClelland from Covenant. On next week's show, Erica Voss, our very own Chief Information Security Officer. Erica Voss is going to be on talking about cybersecurity. I'm on with Jimmy Mack on Radio Nemo on Sirius XM 146. I'm here in Australia presenting at the National Road Freighters Association Conference in Brisbane, Australia this Saturday. Chad, anything on your end?
Nope. Thanks, status quo right
You're
now.
good?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Everyone, make sure you set up alerts for our live show. Subscribe to our channel at DAT Freight and Analytics. And with that, another show is in the books. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for watching. Be safe. Be nice to everyone. We'll see you back here again at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific next week.